It's quite dark. Not quite dark. Oh, it's better.
Okay, you're on.
Got Dead Victor at the back. Hello, hi. It's Andrew, and I am doing this live commentary, partly in memory of my lovely van cat, Mika, who sadly was knocked over on the road 2 or 3 days ago. A gorgeous, gorgeous little van cat, little Turkish girl. They're supposed to swim, van cats. I have one who does, but Mika never did. Anyway, cats. It's a great joy to be able to talk you through cats. And I thought for some of you who maybe don't really know too much about the history of Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats by T.S. Eliot, just might be a good idea for me to tell you a little bit about it. It was written roughly in about 1936, 1935, 1936. They were a series of, people say, off-duty poems by T.S. Eliot, written for his godchildren, and used to send them in letters to their parents. And of course, being T.S. Eliot's friends, of course, they were quite bright parents, to put it mildly. So he kind of wrote these poems, obviously to be read by the parents, but to be appreciated by the parents, but by the children as well. And the extraordinary thing about them, I think, is that they are incredibly, incredibly witty and urbane. It's the sort of understated wit through it all is just extraordinary to me. They were first read to me by my mother when I was about 7 or 8 years old. And they stayed with me really all my life. They were always something I used to refer to. If I was a bit depressed, sometimes I'd read them in bed, and I just loved them. And I got to know the characters. And I always thought that maybe it would be fun one day to set them to music. And what happened really was that after I had written with Tim Rice, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and obviously Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita, I was wondering whether or not I could actually set existing lyrics, because the way that Tim and I worked is that I would write the music once we'd come up with a plot together. And I thought that I just didn't know whether or not I could actually set existing verse as opposed to writing the music and then Tim Rice setting the music that I'd written to, to his lyrics. And I sort of did them really for a bit of fun. It was just like a kind of exercise to myself. And I just, anyway, I did 4 of them at my little festival that we do every year at Sydmonton. And it really went, they really went rather well. And I then began to think of them possibly as a companion piece to the Paganini variations that I wrote for my brother Julian. They came out in 1978, I think it was. And they were a big hit in Britain. And everybody thought about doing a dance show based around those variations. I just wondered whether it would be a way that you could sing and read the poems, Old Possum's poems, as a kind of like a first half to the variations. And it was just an idea. I toyed with it really quite a lot. And it never really got anywhere. We tried them, the setting of the whole lot of them at Sydmonton, and I asked Valerie Elliott, T.S. Eliot's widow, she'd like to come, and she did. And she gave me afterwards a poem called Grisabella the Glamour Cat that never appeared in the original Old Possum's book. Valerie said it was because Eliot himself thought it was too sad for children. And I suddenly thought, this is quite different. It gives a completely new dimension to the piece. Maybe, just maybe, there is some kind of bigger event than just it being a first half to my variations. And I don't know, I happened to have lunch with Cameron Mackintosh. Cameron Mackintosh in those days was, he was not the great impresario that he is today. Cameron was a producer who had done some very successful productions of old musicals and also a couple of new ones, but he wasn't a sort of huge producer in the West End. But we got on famously well. And I said to him, I got this crazy idea that maybe the poems by T.S. Eliot could be some kind of musical. And he said, well, maybe they could. And we started to talk to the late, great Gillian Lynne, the fabulous British choreographer who, of course, went on to choreograph Cats and is a huge, huge reason why it became the success that it did. Things started to evolve from there. I discovered through Valerie Elliott a poem about pollicle dogs and jellicle cats. They're called pollicle dogs and jellicle cats because, as Valerie Elliott explained to me, Elliott thought of the very upper-class English pronunciation of poor little dogs and dear little cats, so they became pollicle dogs and jellicle cats. And there was this poem, and with it, there was also a whole idea about how the cats and dogs in that poem went to a special event, which we didn't know what it was, but we then realized it was meant to be the Jellicle Ball. And that after that event, one cat was chosen, and the cat then went in a big balloon way, way past the Russell Hotel with an Elliott lyric that he actually sketched, which was up, up, up past the Russell Hotel, up, up, up to the Heaviside Lair. It was actually there. And I thought, my goodness, we have got the basis of a musical. If it was hugely about dance, it just might work. And then rather brilliantly, Cameron Mackintosh suggested that we talk to Trevor Nunn. Trevor Nunn at that time was the director of the Royal Shakespeare Company. And Trevor, after a lot of thinking about it, came on board. And of course, that was great because he understood, obviously, like no other director really could, how we had to preserve T.S. Eliot's language. Yet Trevor was, in his own way, a fantastic showman. He'd done a couple of productions that were really almost musicals, and had also worked with Gillian Lynne. And so the team was put together. Trevor Nunn immediately suggested John Napier, who he had worked with before on the really very famous production of Nicholas Nickleby. And John Napier had also designed Equus, it was a really fantastic team. We had then to design, or how could we make this work? And the one thing that we felt is that it had to in some way be environmental theatre. And that's where we found when we found the New London Theatre, which is now, of course, the Gillian Lynne, because it's been renamed in the honour of the choreographer who made the whole thing possible, really. And anyway, that was kind of it. We were away on an adventure that, it hadn't really been done before. Nobody had in Britain anyway put together something where dance was at the very, very centre of it. And the big thing was, how do we make it possible for the human beings to be cats? And John Napier decided that, it could obviously be done with wigs. He had these rather wonderful sort of punky wigs. It was the time when sort of punk rock was happening in London. And he had these, they were extraordinary creations and these incredibly witty costumes. But I think that the really extraordinary thing that he came up with is something so simple, is that if you look at a human and you see them standing up and they've got a sort of cat wig and cat makeup, and the one thing you do look is you look at their body, you don't sort of buy it. And what he did was he picked up on the fact that all the dancers around at the time, as they still do, were wearing leg warmers, and they had these little leg warmers around the bottom of their their legs, and they were furry. And so he had the dancers wearing what they would normally be wearing, i.e. leg warmers, but he made them into fur and part of the costume. And that broke up the line so that when you saw the humans on stage, you could buy the fact that they might be cats. Of course, they were humans as cats, but there was something kind of wonderfully honest and wonderfully simple about what John invented. Having said all of that, I might as well tell you that when it was announced that I was doing my first musical really without Tim Rice, I had done one before, which was called Jeeves, and it was with Alan Ayckbourn, and it was a disaster. And when it was that you announced that I was working with the director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, Cameron Mackintosh, who in those days wasn't the mega producer he is now, that we were going into a theatre called the New London, where Grease had appeared with Richard Gere in the lead, and it had been a disaster. When it was announced that we were intending to do dance, that we were I was setting to music the poems of T.S. Eliot, who was, of course, an American, but no longer with us, playwright. Shall we put it, where the musical theatre, kind of those who perhaps don't want you to succeed, were rubbing their hands with glee for one of the greatest catastrophes that could have ever happened. We actually opened with half our investment missing, a mortgage for me on my house, because I was the only person who had a few bob in those days. And it was, oh gosh, a hairy night, to put it mildly. And all I can say is that the moment when the first cat came out on stage, we thought could have been perhaps the biggest moment of bathos in musical theatre history. That's all I can say. I remember Cameron and I just hiding backstage, and there were these kids in our cast, who had all kind of given their all to be with us during rehearsals. I remember they were all so young, just turning to us and saying, "What are we doing here?" And I remember the overture starting. Oh, there was one little thing about the overture, which I have to say, is that it was written for the Gillian Lynn / New London Theatre. And we had this fantastic revolving turntable in there that could move the audience and move the entire set. And it started with if you came into the theatre, if you were in the seats, which were the really expensive ones, you stood, you sat down and you looked at the back of the set, and people got mad. They kept saying, we haven't paid money to look at the back of an old car. And, but what happened was the whole set revolved round. And during the course of the overture, the cat set and the theatre was formed. There was a wonderful byline, which was latecomers will not be admitted while the auditorium is in motion. I can't remember who came up with that. It wasn't me, but I'd love to have said it was. Anyway, so Cats was away, and oh God, that first night had me in apoplectic worry. Now, I'm looking at my daughter over there, who is my technician, and I've got to do something like press something, have I? To say go, or not yet? Oh, I got to keep talking. Anyway, I've got 2 minutes. What else can I tell you? Well, let me tell you a little bit about what this is. This is the stage show, of course, filmed. It was filmed over 3 days, but actually there was one performance with 12 cameras, and we repaired it over the next couple of days. My ears have fallen out. Never mind. That's just something the old cry. Oh, I got the wrong way around. Never mind. I don't need them yet. Anyway, so we filmed this over 3 days. It was all basically pre-recorded. There were 12 camera angles. We used a new process. It was a new process at the time, where you could literally move the synchronization of the faces to everything. So if the performances were slightly vocally out of sync, we could adjust it. When we were very, very pleased with that, because it was at that time completely new. But basically, the essence of this is actually one performance with just 1 or 2 retakes, 12 different cameras, and it was the touring cast of Cats at the time. The film rights had been sold some time ago, but nobody seemed to want to make the film. And we thought that maybe the only way we could get around having a version of it was to make this version of the stage show. And I must say, having seen it again the other day, I was really quite pleased with it. And it seems to hold up pretty well. Anyway, am I supposed to do something now? No, my daughter's sighing at me. Anyway, the stage show was, it was, of course, what Cats is all about. Cats is the ultimate theatrical experience, in my view. And I'm really, really, really pleased to be able to show you take this performance of it. 22 years old now, but I hope it stands up just as well as it did then.
Counting down.
And we're counting down 1 minute 52, 1 minute 51, 1 minute 50. Gosh, the overture was 2 minutes 14. I tell you why the overture was 2 minutes 14, because that's exactly the time that the New London Revolve took to get to its final position. I could do the overture now, it's 1 minute 36. Gosh, it's a little bit like being on live TV. Actually, maybe I am on live TV, I don't know. Used to do these programs. Finally, just let me say, it was the UK touring company, but we were absolutely overjoyed to have the great Elaine Page, the one and only Elaine Page, our original Evita on stage in London. One of the finest performers I've ever had the joy of working with. Absolutely fantastic. No relation, Ken Page, who was our original Deuteronomy on Broadway. Absolutely one of the great Deuteronomies. And a huge joy to me, Sir John Mills, who played Gus the Theatre Cat. And I think you'll agree it's as consummate a performance as you'd ever see. I mean, John Mills, one of the finest actors we've ever had. And of course, father of Hayley Mills, who every child of my generation was in love with when she was in Whistle Down the Wind, and many, many other things. Was it The Parrot Trap? I thought, I forget what we got, 35 seconds, 34. The suspense is actually killing me. I don't quite know what to say. Hope it's not boring you. We're about to go. The cats are all ready. They're all lined up. I'm going to put my earpiece in. This is going to be quite an epic moment. And let me finally say that it's dedicated to Mika, my beloved van cat.
Can you hear something?
I can hear. Thank you. And please give generously to the Actors Fund. Okay. How do I do something?
No.
And we're off. Well, by now, the audience was on opening night totally confused. The set was revolving. And we got to this point, and this is the moment where the actors came into the audience with their cat's eyes. And everything was revolving, and it was all becoming very disorientating. I wish I could have shown you this, but it was impossible to do, of course. You'll just have to imagine those cat's eyes staring at you for real. And this, of course, is the great cat theme. And I'm thinking of dearest Mika when I hear this. And I hope you really enjoy the way the dance is directed in this. It was directed by David Mallet, obviously hugely based on Trevor Nunn's original production. David Mallet was one of the greatest, video directors we had in Britain. And he really worked closely with Gilly Lynn to make sure that the dance was captured faithfully. And this is the moment that Cameron and I were backstage thinking, what are we doing here? And then the first cat came out. I don't know who that guy is. You get the scale of John Napier's brilliant set. There were 12 cameras going as we did this. Michael Gruber, who plays Munkus Trap, was in Chorus Line and in Miss Saigon on Broadway.
I'm doing. He's doing.
Thank you, my dear.
No, just stop it. Can you hear?
That's Ken Page, of course, our original Deuteronomy on Broadway. Yeah. I feel awful talking through all of this, but that was Sue Jane Tanner, who was in the original London production, along with Elaine. So I was rather watching this, thinking this is actually really much closer to what I wrote than certain other productions. Favorite moment of mine coming up now. Not quite yet. I always wanted to actually be the person in the flies when this happened, to do this next big move. Never got to it there. One day maybe I will. You see, we didn't take ourselves completely seriously. This lyric, of course, is written by Richard Stilgoe, who filled in where T.S. Eliot obviously couldn't, although it was hugely based on Jellicle songs, or Pollicle dogs and Jellicle cats. Richard brilliantly, I think, and probably very few people could have done this. He adopted, I think, Eliot's tone of voice and helped us tell our story. Eliot never wrote Vivat and Cat. Probably it's one rhyme he didn't do. This is where Gilly is so clever. Gosh, this in the theatre is always, to me, one of the great moments. Now, this is original Eliot. All of this is an Eliot lyric. It was the end of his Pollicle Dogs and Jellicle Cat poem. I sang a demo of that once. Unluckily, it's actually on some obscure LP or no, album of mine. I've got a note actually asking me about who did the sound and who was the mixer on this. Well, I was very much involved with it, but it was the great Nigel Wright who, I had my musical A team on this. Anyway, I'm going to be quiet because you want to hear about the addressing of cats, because you need to know how to address a cat at all times. The naming of cats being really important. John's wigs are amazing, aren't they? What he did. But it was my musical A team, Nigel Wright, who I've worked with very closely for very many years. And he absolutely understands, how to mix for theatre and also how to, mix for film. It's something that is inherently theatrical, as well as being one of the nicest people in the business. That's something we couldn't do in the film, of course, because the cats broke out all over the theatre. To give an idea of it. This set was built specifically based around the John Napier design. It is the John Napier design exactly, but it was built specifically for this film. And it was in the Adelphi Theatre in London. But as I said, this is one performance taken one afternoon, 12 different cameras, and then reshot where there were some repair pieces that we felt we needed to do over the next 2 days. The whole thing was done in 3 days. And we're coming up, of course, to a moment that I know for many people is iconic, and I think is the moment that Gillian Lynn will always be remembered for, which is the White Cat Surlo dance. It was meant to be a surlo, it always should be a surlo. And I always think this is absolutely beautiful and wonderfully feline. You see what I mean about the leg warmers? You see it cover the knees, and they make, it's such a simple way of making a human, of keeping the fact that they're humans, but they're also cats, and it's just a simplest device. This is all Elliot, and now it becomes still go. Now, the cat's meow sound was something I was very, very proud of. We did it originally on a mini Moog, the original Moog synthesizer. I was very, very excited when we found it, and I don't think we've ever found a better version of it than the original analog synthesizer could do. We used to have great fun having it in the round around the theatre. Surround sound everywhere. Gumby Cat coming up. Originally, the Gumby was much longer than this. It was a great big sequence with the mice, but we, I think, rather wisely cut it. And this is now the length that we played, after we've been in preview, and have done constantly all the time since then. Great for me to hear it without interruptions and interpolations and silly moments that stop the flow of the lyric and the music. That's
good. Okay.
This was, of course, meant to be a version a bit like the Andrews Sisters. I think it was rather fun to sort of think of a kind of almost a wartime Second World War arrangement for this. There's our Gumby. Again, the costumes are so brilliantly witty, and the whole idea is they were things that the cats could have found in the rubbish dump where they were that night. So great to hear it without interpolations, interruptions, and the tugger, played by John Partridge. John Partridge. He was in chorus line. Now, you're not going to believe this. He went on to win a program in Britain about cooking called Celebrity MasterChef in 2018. John Partridge. I do hope his winning dish wasn't partridge. Again, John's got the whole wonderful pastiche of a rock and roller. I often wonder, I don't think an English poet in the 1930s could possibly have written this, because, obviously Eliot was American, but the irregularity of the words, I'm going to say lyric, extraordinary, because it gets the whole thing about a cat who's not in the right place in the meter of the verse. They were a great joy to set to music, I have to say. They almost set themselves at times. I wouldn't have guessed immediately looking at this that he was a master chef, but there you go. Never judge appearances, I guess. He's great. one of the early previews, Paul Nicholas, who was playing the tugger, came out into the audience. One night, he used to ruffle everybody's hair, and then he ruffled the hair of some guy and his toupee fell off, which was slightly unfortunate. Another night, he kind of ruffled the hair of some Arab oil magnate, and two security men who were sitting beside him came up and hustled him away. It was... I suppose this probably shows that the team involved with the show were children of the rock and roll times. And maybe we were a little influenced by Elvis, you never know. But what about a little shout out for Little Richard? I mean, the guy who really, really influenced all of us, the original rocker and glam rocker. Great speed, this, though I say it myself. The thing is, Cats is about joy. Oh, maybe not now. The wonderful Elaine Page. I don't know whether I should really talk over this or not, really, but I must tell you a story about Barbra Streisand coming to the theatre when it was originally in London, because she was interested in recording Memory. And it was great fuss. She didn't want to come into the theatre, when the lights were up, because she thought she'd be recognised. And anyway, we had to explain to her that the theatre moved, that the auditorium was in motion. Anyway, we sneaked her in, and we organised these canopies for her at the interval. We said we got her out, and got which Nick Allott, who was the theatre manager, organised, and we got drinks, we got champagne, absolutely everything. And she said, "No, I don't want any of this. I want milk." Now, I suppose you could say then in the Cats Theatre we should have had milk, but of course we didn't. I mean, all we had was that sort of long life stuff, in those little tiny little cartons, and those little tiny things. So poor old Nick Allott, as theatre manager, had to go out, and he found all these little tiny milk cartons and put them into a glass for her. At which point she decided that she wanted to leave because she said she was getting claustrophobia and didn't want to go back. Anyway, a couple of days later, she did record Memory, and of course it was a fantastic version. This is all original Eliot, found in the main body of his work. It's not obviously in the Cats poems. And this was the story of Grisabella the Glamour Cat that Valerie Elliott gave me, which made me think that there was something far bigger than just an anthology of the poems, and that we could maybe make a musical out of it. I love it. I love Elaine's sort of kind of extraordinary kind of presence, and you feel that there is a really inner strength there, as well as her being the faded cat. I slightly relate this to my lovely cat Mika, because we have two boy cats who came in afterwards, and frankly they bullied her, and we had to separate them for a long time. Well, we did. So poor Mika, in a way, was, although she was very beautiful. Now we have Bustopher Jones. Bustopher without interruption, as I wrote it. Do not be beguiled by other versions. Other versions with unfunny interpolations, which I begged to be cut out. I did manage to get the worst removed. I cannot tell you how absolutely un-Eliot it all was in this song. Eliot is making this wonderful, wonderful observation about the kind of big sort of guy who always had a routine and bustled around St. James's between club to club to club. I met such a person once with my father, who my father knew very well, called H.P. Chadwick Healy. I remembered him, and I always thought that he would have been a wonderful Bustopher. He certainly didn't hang around on a seesaw. Trevor Nunn and I used to have a little game where we tried to guess what the clubs were in London in St. James's that T.S. Eliot was satirizing. We couldn't work it out at all. Foxes and Blimps. We guessed that the Tomb might be the Athenaeum. I don't know why we thought the Tomb was the Athenaeum. Very unfair on the Athenaeum. A rather wonderful building, the Athenaeum. Greek Revival for architectural fans. 19th century, early 19th century Greek Revival building of excellent quality. Again, Eliot's wit. What about this? This song is about wit, not coarse jokes. It's also about taking the song at the right speed. This has one of my favorite lines, this song. It must and it shall be spring in Pall Mall while Bustopher Jones wears white spats. Look at Napier's costume. I mean, oh, it's so clever, isn't it? Just look at those leg warmers again, and you see what I mean. That's the great moment. He's preserved all his life a routine. That's what I mean. So many people would say, isn't it, of that type, of that generation. Everything I've done is a great routine. Wanted for Everything. That actually came from the Tom Stoppard screenplay that was never shot. It was a very, very brilliant idea when it was going to be animated. and started with a tracking shot across London where there was the most gigantic traffic jam. And the tracking shot moved to Tower Bridge, where the jam was absolutely caught up, 2 lines of traffic, not able to move at all. It was because old Deuteronomy was asleep in the middle, and then we saw a sign saying Macavity wanted for everything. Now, Monger Jerry and Rumpelteazer, I've had a question about that just passed to me, which I must answer. This is the version that was written for the Broadway production. Actually, very much at the requests of the producers there, the Schubert organization, the Schuberts, Bernie Jacobs and Jerry Schoenfeld, great, wonderful theatre people who sadly not with us anymore, but became great friends of mine. And I really wrote this for them. I like it. I don't know, sometimes I like this version, sometimes I like the other one, the original one we had in London. But this was very much done for Gilly and the choreography too. And I think this has got some of her best work. It also has a section in my beloved 7/8 time. Coming up now, you can all count it, can't you? 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. It's worth saying that you can't give a vocal performance while you're dancing like this and doing this sort of work, or certainly not one that is worth having. And therefore, it's one of the reasons why a lot of this was pre-recorded. But the artists, they had 12 speakers on stage and they were able to keep really pretty perfect time, but using the technique that was new at the time. It was very, very, very new then. We were able to just move the frames of the pictures if ever there was anything slightly out of sync. And 1 or 2 things were repaired afterwards vocally. But as I've said earlier, this is really one performance. It was one afternoon with repairs over a couple of days. It was all done in 3 days because these were really basically the cast of the touring version at the time in Britain. Joe Gibb, who played Rumpelteazer, went on to play Starlight Express, Pearl in Starlight Express, and she was in Beauty and the Beast for Disney. Gosh, it brings back memories seeing all these people. It was funny that Tom Stoppard's version of screenplay, it never happened. It was going to be obviously animated, and it was it really used some of the songs within actually a story that he created. There were some very, very clever things in there. But I think when I think back on it, really, you can't impose too much of a story on this. I mean, it doesn't really have a story, but it's a fantastic theatrical experience in my view. I just hope this does give you some idea of what it's like in the theatre. It was also very much made because we were very conscious at the time that quite a lot of people hadn't seen it in the theatre, might never be able to get to see it in the theatre. And we wanted to have a record of it, thinking, of course, at the time that it probably never would be filmed in any way. But this is very, very much the stage show, with nothing imposed on it. This is one of my very favorite moments coming up. The wonderful Ken Page. Coming up is the Peaks and the Pollicles, which we still do in the latest version that was done on Broadway. This is the moment where the cats all dress up as dogs, and it comes from Eliot's original idea that there would be both cats and dogs in his anthology. This was the moment that when we saw it in the final dress rehearsal, that Cameron Mackintosh and I decided that it possibly was the most dreadful thing we'd ever seen in our lives on a stage. And we thought to each other, what are we going to do? How are we going to cut this? What do we say to our director and choreographer other than please do something about it? So when it was on the first preview, when it was about to happen, this song, we went and hid in the bar and we poured ourselves an extremely large drink. And suddenly we heard these gales of laughter and applause. And we stood at the back of the theatre and thought, are we believing what we're seeing? The audience is loving this. And it just shows you, doesn't it, that, gosh, sometimes the old adage about a dress rehearsal not working is absolutely something you have to remember. It can be quite different when an audience is there. And again, this is hugely due to the wit of John Napier with his fabulous, dog costumes made out of the detritus and the muck around the rubbish dump. Their cardboard boxes as their feet. Terrible, terrible slight on dogs, the whole thing. Especially as I got a lovely, lovely little Havanese dog called Mojito. He's not here. He's gone and run off in disgust, I think. This is just so clever costume-wise. It's all the stuff that they've found. Again, I can't see an English poet writing this, can you? Oh, look. Mojito's walked in. Not very interested. Come and say hello to everybody, Mojito. Just watch these cats being dogs. Come on, be a good boy. Now this is an Eliot poem too, we discovered, a snippet about dogs. This is Little Tom Pollicle, which I think was Tom Eliot's nickname, Faber and Faber, the publishing company he founded. Maybe it's Little Tom Pollicle. Yes, that's the one. And we got so excited to find another unpublished Eliot poem that we put it in. Again, costumes, look at those. Note the car registration number on this one is TSE1. In all the stage shows, they were NAP 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as the productions opened after John Napier, the designer of the set. And this is really taking me back, actually. So I haven't seen this for ages and ages. In some productions, he comes up through the floor in what's called a star trap. It's the way he used to bring people up through the floor. Normally in Aladdin, the genie used to pop up through the floor. Now, these days, with health and safety, star traps are almost a thing of the past because they propel the actor at this huge speed up. This is another piece of real Eliot verse. I should say something about the wonderful lighting. Oh, it's by David Hersey, one of our great lighting designers. Of course, it was somewhat relit for filming, but I think it's pretty much got the essence of the light and extraordinary light and shade he had. We're coming into the Jellicle songs with Jellicle cats. I think I showed earlier in the week the handwritten manuscript of this that Valerie Elliott gave me, which is one of my great proud possessions, and signed by T.S. Eliot. I'd love to mention one of our dancers in this ball coming up now, who was in the original cast, a wonderful girl called Femi Taylor. And it is rather fabulous to think that we have got some of the very, very original cast members in this. Of course, in the very original London production, Sarah Brightman played Jemima, the young cat who sings the first version of Memory, or the introduction to Memory in the second act. That's a wonderful costume design, don't you think? It's the colors and the variation of them that was so brilliant, I think. And I must tell you a story, though, that I hope John Napier won't mind me saying this, but you saw how in the Peaks and the Pollicles he used all of those cardboard boxes and everything and used them to such great effect. He designed for the ball these brilliant ball costumes. I mean, they were a celebration made out of old crackers and things that were lying around in the rubbish dump and everything. And they were just astounding costumes. I mean, really as good as you can get. There was a problem that, of course, you couldn't dance in them. And so, these costumes literally were like 5 or 10% of the budget. And for a show like ours, where we weren't even sure whether we could make it through, and we didn't. We opened with our investment, half of it missing, apart from the bit and mortgage on my house and all that. To lose such a huge part of our budget and the costumes, which were wonderful, but just not possible to be, danced in, was like a big blow. And anyway, I remember John, in fury, kicked the whole lot down the stairs at the back of the theatre. I never know what happened to them. A few of them became bits and pieces of the set, but they were fabulous. I do hope somewhere there are some photos of them, but I can't find them. I'm going to leave you to watch this for a moment, because I think this is Gillian's great tour de force.
Okay, there, we're there. There's the ball. If you'll reconnect, it comes back in.
Got it. Well, the ball was written very much to the choreography, but equally so. It was a very close collaboration with Gillian, and it was written as completely written as a piece of music, and it's nice for me to hear it like this because it doesn't work so well if it's all truncated and cut up, and it's got all its climaxes and highs and lows musically. As I said, it's 12 different cameras that were used to shoot this. This is always one of Gilly's favorite moments. Gilly was a very naughty lady, really, and she did love her slightly erotic sequences, which I have to admit, this is very, very Gilly. I'm not going to use some of the words she used when she was directing this particular sequence. This is sort of where Trevor was so brilliant, the idea of bringing Grisabella into the ball and her being rejected by the other cats. Again, back in 1981, nobody in London had ever seen British dancers or really any dance musical like this. And I can't really think of any other choreographer who could have achieved it. Our American friends, the Schuberts, were very keen to, I'm going to be honest about this, they were keen to have the show possibly re-choreographed for America. They asked Michael Bennett to come and have a look at it. And I remember that night well, because of course Michael Bennett, chorus line and everything, was an absolute legend. And Cameron Mackintosh and I were going to take him out to dinner afterwards and ask him what he thought. And I remember him saying, "You shouldn't change a single thing." He said, "There might be one or two little moves that I would have done differently, but I wouldn't even think of wanting to re-choreograph this. So I don't believe anybody else could have done it." And actually, we went home with him to my flat in London and my apartment in London, and he then managed to dance the entire musical by Irving Berlin called Mr. President. It was very, very funny night, I have to say. Never laughed so much. I don't think I ever remember it. He moved all the furniture around and reenacted the whole of this musical. Anyway, he wrote a letter to Bernie Jacobs, well, to Gillian Lynn. I'm sorry, he wrote it to Gillian Lynn saying, "Your work is absolutely extraordinary, and I wouldn't change a thing, and you're to be congratulated and must bring this to Broadway as it is." And nobody in the Schuberts could really believe it. And even at one point, they said that it can't really have come from him, which was absolutely ludicrous. But anyway, it was one of those things. I mean, it was all forgotten, but it was an extraordinary thing that Michael Bennett absolutely thought Gilly had done something really unique with this. And it was the whole show. You've got to remember, the whole thing is dance, really, apart from the one moment where Gus the theatre cat is stationary, and memory, of course. I do want to give a shout out to Nigel Wright, who was so instrumental in producing the music of this, because I'm hearing it now just through a little earpiece, but I'd forgotten just how well the music of this was actually put together. And it was really Nigel who understands, I think, something which a lot of producers don't, which is how to mix theatrically. A lot of this is recorded at the old CTS studios in Wembley, near Wembley Stadium, which is now demolished and no longer there. There are very, very few. Well, look at that. I mean, it was great. When we first did the show, Grisabella the Glamour Cat was here, but I felt it was after that the audience really wanted to get to the end of the act, which was coming up, and so we moved it back to where it is and has been ever since, after the Tugger. Just this little reprise. I always love this line, "You see the corner of her eye twist like a crooked pin." It's Elaine, as well as being one of the great singers we've had in musical theatre, very, very good dancer. She danced beautifully in Evita. There was something extraordinary about her original Evita. And I think it was the fact that she's quite small, but there was just something about her where you got the essence and the whole drive that Eva Peron clearly had. And she really captures, I think, the sadness and the yearning that Grisabella is feeling, leading into the early version of Memory. This is an adaptation of a section of Rhapsody on a Windy Night, which Trevor Nunn identified, and he adapted the Eliot verse for what became Memory. And originally, I'd never intended Memory to be in Cats. I'd written it for something else, which was an idea that never ever happened. It was a silly idea I had about the writing of the opera La Bohème. It was about how the composer Puccini, whose Bohème is the one everybody remembers, was going to write it with Leoncavallo as the lyricist, or I suppose librettist, you'd say. But Leoncavallo had a rather big hit himself with Pagliacci, and he decided that he, as a composer, would write it himself too. So there were two versions of Bohème going on. The Leoncavallo one opened to rave reviews and is not exactly performed very often. I have heard it, or rather I've heard a third of it. I couldn't really quite stay the course. And the Puccini one opened to terrible reviews, and of course everybody remembers it. And it was my idea that there should be an opera about the rival between the two of them, and this melody would be something that would be in the Puccini version of it, but was cut from it. This is a very complicated story, but when everybody says Memory is Puccini-esque, I always say, yes, it was Puccini-esque because it was written for this idea, and it is. But I remember when I first wrote it, I took it to my dad, who was a great Puccini expert, and I said, Dad, please tell me, is this like something else? Does it remind you of anything? And my dad said, yes, it does, darling boy. It reminds me of several $1 million. And I thought, well, maybe. Gosh, I mean, it was meant to be, though, for something else. But Trevor said, we need something for Grisabella with great emotion. And I rather tentatively played it to him in a rehearsal studio in Battersea, I remember, when we were casting. And he said, this is the one we need. And of course, it became probably our best known song. I have said all of that story many, many times before, so I hope I'm not boring anybody by repeating it. This was the end of the first act. That was the end of the first act. And the second act started in total silence. I always said to Trevor, don't you think we need an entr'acte? How can we start in total silence? And he said, the audience will shut up very, very quickly when we have the cats crawling through. Of course, we cut a lot of that for this. But I was always very pleased with this music, which of course becomes developed later as part of the Macavity music, actually. And this is the great Sir John Mills as Gus. Well, I mean, I think many people will remember him as one of the greatest, greatest actors Britain ever had, really. It was Pippin, Great Expectations for David Lean. Oh gosh. He won the Academy Award, Best Supporting Actor in Ryan's Daughter. He's got this most wonderful, open, lovable face, hasn't he? I think I'm right in saying this may be the last performance he ever gave before he died. I can't absolutely say that. One thing for people who know the stage show, we decided not to do Growl Tiger's Last Stand in this version, but you'll forgive us. Now this, of course, is Ken Page. The Moments of Happiness, again, is an Eliot lyric. Trevor Nunn, I know, was really very, very keen to use this because it had the word ineffable in it. Apart from the fact that it did seem to, when the whole idea of Eliot often had about a new life, that was a real reason. But of course, he uses the an ineffable, deep and inscrutable single R. This is, of course, was Sarah Brightman's moment. It was always very, very special for me when Sarah sang this. But I had no idea at the time that she really had the kind of soprano voice that she developed later. In fact, she was let out of the show to do a musical at the Lyric Hammersmith by Charlie Strauss, who wrote Annie, called Nightingale. It was an opera, and she played the Nightingale. She got these incredibly good reviews for it, and I didn't really know that she had a big soprano range, because I only saw her because she was really a dancer in Cats. Then I went to go and see her in it, and I rather changed my mind. I suppose it's an interesting little anecdote that I married a cat, Trevor Nunn married a cat, and John Napier married a cat. Such was it a life changer for us all. Look at John's face here. Sue Jane Tanner, she went on to open in Les Miserables. I'm not going to talk through John's performance. Beautiful, and it's beautifully actually sung as well. I don't think we're allowed to have cats at theatres anymore, because of sort of health and safety regulations, in case somebody gets asthma or something. But I think I'm going to ignore this, and when the Theatre Roger Lane reopens, I think I'm going to get a theatre cat for it. I think it needs one. I think all the theatres need cats. Both Irving and Tree were actors in this Theatre Roger Lane, I think.
Yes, please. Okay, well, I'm gonna make
That was done in one take. We never reshot that at all. A fantastic performance by a really, really fine actor. People don't really think of him as a singer or musical theatre actor because obviously he was in things like Waterloo Road and Way to the Stars and military movies like that. And I have a feeling, I'm probably getting this wrong and I will be attacked by people, but I think he was in a musical called The Good Companions. Didn't do anything. It was in Her Majesty's, where Phantom is. Ah, no, this is Skimble Shanks. My favourite cat, really. I love Skimble. Lovely little. He's a Scottish cat. Cameron and I used to say that from here onwards, the show was absolutely cast down, and we never thought we really needed to do too much to it afterwards. We never ever changed the order of anything from here. It was Skimble McCavity and Mephistopheles. If you haven't seen this before, just watch the invention that John Napier has with Trevor Nunn. You know, when they created the train. You'll see the railway train in a minute out of all the rubbish again, lying around in the rubbish dump. This is the one that I think I said the other day that I was told by Valerie Elliott that Elliott wrote his poems very often, a lot of his poems, to music that was a big success at the time in the 1930s, which put me into a bit of a lather, I must say. But I couldn't work out what they were, but I think I'm pretty sure about this one, but I'm not going to give it away now. Luckily, it couldn't be further removed, actually, from what I wrote. But I could be wrong about what I think he wrote it to. There's a very, very funny story about what happened during one of the performances of Skimble Shanks, which I think I probably better not tell. But let me put it this way. It involved a member of the audience who had been to the Indian restaurant opposite, and the curry she had didn't completely agree with her. And I'm not going to tell the story. I'll probably children watching this. See what I mean about John Napier and Trevor and Jilly? Oh, wonderful Jilly. Chile had this idea, which absolutely right, that he was this fussy little fellow. He was always bustling around, trying to make sure everybody was on the train and everything was right and everything was fine. And it's a joy to see what she did again. Yes, we originally had Macavity sung by two girls. Who are supposed to have known Macavity in their past. This is always one of my very favorite poems when I was a kid. Of course, Macavity is Eliot's version of Moriarty in Sherlock Holmes. Very, very definitely, it must have been Moriarty who he was thinking of. The most evil, evil person on earth. The most evil cat, I mean. Dog reference coming up. How many of you know a cat who has caused utter destruction, and yet there is absolutely no evidence of the cat having been anywhere near the scene? Certainly I have. Well, actually, most of mine seem to get into such scrapes. Well, I'm one of my beloved van cats, or one cats, if you're being accurate about pronunciation, literally had 9 lives. Sort of fell into oil tanks, would steal turkeys at Christmas time, and then get himself literally into kind of broke glass, you name it. But the Napoleon of crime. Yes. I used to have arguments with Gillian about this one because I love the choreography, but I always liked to take the song a little slower than she did. But this is Gilly's speed, and I think it does work so well for a choreography that I slightly take it back. But if I hear the song on its own, I quite like it a little slower, but that's because of the brass writing, you see. But it's pretty, very well done, isn't it? Now this gets a bit frightening for me, so I might have to cover my eyes. I got terribly frightened by Bambi when I was a child. I thought that was the most frightening thing I'd ever seen. Cover your eyes, children. Don't want you to have nightmares. Now, this is a bit I always like very much in the theatre, the Macavity fight. Great fun, nice and demonic and pagan. It's the sort of stuff that we come to see. This, funnily enough, is the little mock fugue that I wrote in the overture, sort of restated again. My wife had a horse called the Fugue. I named it the Fugue after Twyla Tharp's ballet, the Fugue. Complicated story, but the horse's mum was named Twyla Tharp with her permission. And so the Fugue happened. And of course, nobody in racing particularly knew what a fugue was. So you try and explain it. But I just used to say a musical puzzle. But this is a mock fugue because it isn't really a fugue, but it's got sort of fugue-like little bits. My wife is looking at me very, very crossly across the other side of the room here, yawning, actually. I think that's quite wrong, especially when Macavity is about to get his comeuppance. And I was just talking about fugues. This was a great moment in the theatre because it went into complete darkness. Couldn't quite do this on screen, but there was just total darkness and just this real torch going around the theatre. It was kind of fantastic. Again, another brilliant thought of Trevor Nunn's. Cameron used to say it saved on electricity. Now, this again is another poem that you wouldn't find an English poet of the 1930s writing this. He wrote, this little chorus of "Oh, well, I never was there ever a cat so clever as magical Mr. Mistopheles" is like a lyric, just written as if it was the whole poem is constructed like it's a song. This is, I think this was the first poem I set, actually. But of course, it should be Gorn and Lawn, shouldn't it? That would mean what Eliot was going on about. Then it was Gorn, and you'll find it next week lying out on the lawn. In the original London production, this was Wayne's Sleep, and of course, Wayne did lots of his famous party tricks through all of this. We didn't do it in this film version of them, but he used to do and of course Wayne was very, very famous, of course, subsequently, because he danced on the stage of the Royal Opera House with Princess Diana. Became very, very friendly with Diana, who was to be obsessed with dance, and with Wayne too. TSE 1. seeing this again, of course, what's so noticeable about it is how much warmth there was and joy in Trevor Nunn's direction. Of course, Elaine Page came into the production at very, very short notice because she replaced Judi Dench, who was going to be Grisabella, and who broke her Achilles tendon in rehearsals. And it would have been a very different version of Memory. I won't interrupt this, but talk later. This is an arrangement I did much later after the show opened. Well, not a few months after the show opened, for a full orchestra rather than the little band we had in the theatre. Well, I was saying that Judi Dench had to withdraw from the original production because she unfortunately had snapped her Achilles tendon in rehearsals. And I'm often asked what would have happened had she been Grisabella and sung Memory. And I often say that it would have been a sort of Piafian performance of it. I mean, she's such a fantastic actress that it would have been different, obviously, but I don't think it would have been anything other than a different but incredibly moving performance. As I know what we were sort of beginning to work on and with her, and it was pretty extraordinary. And the irony, I guess, is that Elaine Page herself went on to play Piaf in the West End in the show of the same name. Again, original lyric given to me by Valerie, which gave us the idea that all the cats and dogs would go up in a big balloon and the chosen one from the Jellicle Ball. I'm not ever quite certain what the Heaviside Layer was meant to be. It was probably one of Eliot's little jokes. It's worth saying, actually, that it's all staged in the one set. And the one in London, and the original version of it, the one really big moment, set piece moment, was when the tower rose up. Where is he? Here. Yeah. I'm hearing a cat meowing in the background here somewhere. Yes, it's another one of the van cats. Can't interrupt old Deuteronomy for that, but never mind. I think this is old Deuteronomy. Yes, here he is. This is Oddie. Look, you see, he's got two different coloured eyes, the yellow and the blue eye. Aren't you, Oddie? Yes, now you're going to destroy the entire... What do you think of old Deuteronomy? What do you think? Yes. Are you looking at Mojito, the dog down there? We're talking about how we address you. We are. Oh dear. Now what's happening? He's going to go all over my notes. It's an absolute disaster. Come and sit down. Come and sit down. That's better. Look, come watch the screen. That'd be a good boy. It's Ken Page's old Deuteronomy. Oh dear. Very important statement that a cat is not a dog. There's one thing you take away. I mean, oh, I'm sorry. Oh, he's gone. Oh, there's Mojito down there. Youngling. Which cat is that one? Oh dear. There's bedlam about to break loose in this room, I have to tell you. Any minute, the dog is going to get whacked by the cat. I can see it. Oh no, he's gone. Thank goodness. Now sing along, everybody. A big, big moment. Cats entitled to respect these evidences of respect. So this is this and that is that. And I base this on what happens at the last night of the proms in Britain. Well, there you go. That's the last one of the 6 from stage to screen. I hope you enjoyed that one. It's cats, of course, and thank you for so generously donating. I think we raised $500,000 for the Actors Fund. Absolutely wonderful. And if you could still find it in you to just give a little tiny bit more, it'd be really appreciated by all of the actors who, of course, are having a very tough time at the moment. And but I just hope you realize that theatre is always going to be there. It will come back. I will, I must say, be back. I thought I'd run out of ideas for what to do as composer in lockdown. Didn't think we were going to be locked down for so long, but I'm afraid it might be a bit longer yet. So you can't get rid of me. That's just bad luck. I shall be back doing various things. Maybe I'll, do a little bit from my new Cinderella. You never know. I might pluck up the courage and everything. But I just really want to thank you for being so good to watch all of these, and particularly those of you who stayed through by G. Slow start, I know, but you're the really hardcore. But anyway, this was a great joy for me to see again. I haven't seen it for so long. I'm going to say goodbye, give generously, and thank you.